even if it's a disagreeable review, it's still a review.
Yeah. You guys know I'm starting the stream a little early just so we can get it set up, but you can still wait 10 minutes to officially get going. Just know that your comments will be on the internet.
Oh, okay.
Forever on the internet. I understand.
Okay, so everyone buy Kishore's book, Has China Won? And everyone buy my book, The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, in September 22nd.
September 22nd. Gotta drop the date.
Well, you're lucky, Dan. You're launching it, and when the bookshops are open. When I launched my book in April, all the bookstores all around the world were closed.
Mm-hmm.
So my sales were almost zero.
What about on Amazon?
Amazon too. Actually, the sales on Amazon are not good because in April, May, June, they were prioritizing food deliveries and essential stuff.
Uh-huh.
So book deliveries were deprioritized. So my book hasn't sold well, but I'm sure after my appearance on the Lincoln Network, the sales will shoot up.
That's what I'm hoping. Wait, am I on? Yeah, that's what I'm hoping. Actually, Zach below is the one that told me to read your book as we work on our like telecommunications security, portion of our work at Lincoln.
Yes.
I mean, I also had like 2 pages worth of literature reviews of books and long articles. So I'm glad I got to get through yours. I got through the entire literature review, but yours was definitely my favorite. Like I would listen to it all the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that compliment.
Yeah. I mean, my uncle, I remember I was calling my uncle and I was like, hey, how you doing? Checking up on him. And I was cooking dinner and I had your audiobook on in the background. And he was like, well, what's that? I was like, well, this is this book. This is this guy. He wrote this thing. It's called Has China Won? And he has all these points. And I just think they're so poignant. And we started talking about it. And he was like, it's dinner time. And I want to hear none of it.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. We're good. So I'm really distraught. This is like kind of the perfect little angle in my family's house. And now the sun is not agreeing with me the way that it was 10 minutes ago before I joined. And I don't know what else to say.
You got some shades? Can you bring down the shade or something?
Full windows. Big old windows. They don't have shade. It's okay. It will be okay. And my sister is up in the library. She is also working. So, meh. It is all right. It is all right. So what kind of whiskey do you got there, Mr. Mahbubani?
Well, I'm just a simple black label and soda. Yeah.
I love to see it. Love to see it.
So Dan, are you going on a book tour with your book? Or
You still can't really do book tours, the promotional events are, they're virtual and it's not, it's still COVID. There's no real touring, but we're looking at various kinds of virtual events. I mean, the bookstores aren't fully open, but they can still do events.
Yeah.
My fellowship, I'm a part of the CNAS National Security Fellowship, and we have either weekly or like bi-weekly talks with, if it wasn't COVID, we'd be at dinners with, these different formers in the national security space. And the other day we talked to Secretary Albright, and she was saying at Georgetown, her specifically, but also the other professors are like scrambling to figure out what's going to be on like their literature reviews and, how they're going to do Zooms or whatever. I was thinking like that could be a great way to publicize your book, go on a university book tour to give professors at least one lesson that is already planned, and it will be points in your book.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's part of what we're going to do is send out to various universities and professors and so on. But yeah, it's we're coming up with our publicity plan.
Yeah, I understand.
So where's the best place to get a book reviewed then?
I mean, it's almost impossible nowadays, but it's still the Times and the it's still the New York Times and the Journal and the Post. But increasingly those are sort of celebrity. That real estate is very tough. So as long as it just gets out there by respected people in whatever medium, whatever publication nowadays, it's good, because getting a New York Times book review is it's like hitting a
lottery.
hitting a home run. I mean, it's just almost impossible. There's many ways to promote now, so there's there's through people like yourself, who write about it. There's increasingly, just because it's such a hot topic here, and will be at least through November. There's TV you can do, just quick little hits. There's any chance you can take to get a news hit promotes the book.
Well, I must say the biggest hit I got was when Farid Zakaria recommended it as book of the week. So that was a really big hit.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's you can't get much better than that. I mean, he has quite a following.
Yeah. And then I also appeared on his show, I think twice now since the book appeared.
Oh, that's huge.
I've written 8 books, and this is my 8th one, and 4 were published in New York, and none of them have been reviewed by the New York Times.
No, it's not. I mean,
0. What's it? It's an American 0 for 4 or something like that. Is that a baseball term?
all sports, I guess.
Oh, yeah, right. See, there we go. I definitely thought that was a baseball exclusive term.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm sure as a result of the discussion today, the sales are going to shoot up. So
I think so.
You should display your book too, Dan, like I do.
Yeah, I don't. It's not published. I don't have the copies yet. I'd have to put.
Oh.
The actual printing doesn't happen until 2 weeks from now. So.
Okay.
I could display the cover, but got to figure out how to do that on Zoom. As my background, maybe.
Yeah.
It's got a nice cover.
Yeah. Public Affairs did a good job, so I'm happy.
Who published it?
Public Affairs in New York. Actually, they published all 4 of my New York books. They're a very good publisher. I like them a lot. It was set up by Peter Osnos, the New York Times.
Yeah, sure.
My publisher is Clive Priddle. So.
Yeah, I'm friends with his son, Evan.
Oh, Evan Osnos. Yes. Yeah, I met him once or twice, I think.
Very smart.
He's a superstar, isn't he? His book was a bestseller.
His book is great. It's really a great book.
Yeah.
He's got that journalistic flair.
Yeah. So are we starting at 9, Alexiaa, or?
Yes, sir. Zach already has us, like he said, live, and we are gonna get started at 9, maybe 9:01. Give people a second.
How's the COVID in Washington D.C. then?
It's okay. It's okay.
Not too bad.
No, and things are cautiously open, so people can eat outside. They can eat inside in some places. Um, the stores are open. Yeah, it's okay.
I just watched this video from the World Economic Forum about how Singapore, like the steps that Singapore is taking to open its tourism industry back. I thought it was like really, really novel. Like, so they have people, and this is also on Instagram. So they put it like in a little clip. It was very, very cute. But like scheduling people's tourist times and popular destinations, making sure everything is outdoors, implementing contactless touch screens so you don't actually touch the screen, you just like go right here, giving people care packages and stuff when they come into the country. I was like, wow. Cool.
Slowly, but we're doing it very slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's extremely fair. Okie dokie. Righty. I see people have come in, Zach. Can I just get started at any time or?
Sure.
Zach? I see people are still like lining in. Okie dokie. Yay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexiaa Jordan. I'm the Innovation, Cyber, and National Security Analyst at the Lincoln Network. And today, our webinar is asking whether the US or China is winning. So I don't think today we're going to hear the usual China versus US tropes, because lucky for us, we are going to be discussing these questions with two amazing authors who are extremely nuanced and are very critical of both the US and China. Their respective backgrounds are phenomenal. Professor Kishore Mahbubani published and released the book, Has China Won? In March 2020. He's a retired Singaporean diplomat, former UN ambassador, and he served as president of the UN Security Council from 2001 to 2002. And he is currently the distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Mr. Mahbubani is currently in Singapore and 12 hours ahead of us. So I definitely want to say thank you for joining us at night. If you guys in the US are into day drinking, he invites you all to join him for a glass of whiskey over this conversation. I got some green tea, so I think we're gonna be good. Our second panelist is Mr. Dan Blumenthal. First and foremost, he is a Johns Hopkins SAIS graduate, and I always love bringing alumni around. So thank you. But more importantly, he has advised on China and US relations for more than a decade. He was the senior director for the China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the Department of Defense. And then after that, he served as the commissioner and vice president for the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He then took it a step further and served on the academic advisory board of the Congressional US-China Working Group. And now he's the director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I am so excited. I am honored to have you both here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So let's dive into the good stuff. My first question is for Mr. Blumenthal. I know you are really excited about your book that's coming out. It's coming out on September 22nd, 2020. All the bookstores will be open, so people can go get a copy of it. I love the sneak peek that you gave me, and I'm hoping you can tell the audience just a little bit about some of the ideas that you have in your book and what they can expect.
Sure, thank you very much, and for hosting this, and it's great to see Kishore in Singapore, and thanks for staying up with us. So the book is called The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. And what I'm trying to capture in the book, and hopefully did, was that it's not just China's strengths that pose a danger, it's its weaknesses. So it has many weaknesses that we overlook, and as we can see right now, for example, when Xi Jinping and the leadership of the CCP feel like there is a lot of pressure on them internally, such as over their handling of COVID-19, they tend to lash out, as we can see around us now. So they've been lashing out in Hong Kong, obviously, very quickly moving to imposed the national security law, which ensnares Hong Kong Democrats and so forth. They've been lashing out around India, South China Sea, Taiwan. And they have the strength to be threatening, but I see this as happening because there are big fissures and cracks in the system, and Xi Jinping will do anything to avoid embarrassment. There's a lot of pressure on the system, and so the nightmare scenario for me, as we've seen with COVID-19, is a China that actually is not able to contain its own problems. It turned a local epidemic into a global pandemic and tried to cover it up, but it's still strong enough to, if countries push back and try to hold them to account for these kinds of mistakes, still strong enough to create great disruptions and provocations around the world. That's the nightmare scenario.
Understood. Yeah. So, I, studying foreign policy and coming from the space, I will say that is an opinion that I rarely hear. So I hope people go and go grab your book. I know it's going to be in print soon. It's going to be available online. So I'm excited for some reviews to come out. Mr. Mahbubani, your book, Has China Won, was given to me as background because Lincoln Network is working very, very hard on our position on telecommunication security and the efforts around that. And I listened to that book all times of night. I really enjoyed it because there are some things that you said that I feel like you rarely hear in American discourse. And in the book, you cite how you talk about, you cite conversations with a lot of American and Chinese juggernauts. I mean, former presidents, strategists, everything. And from all that, what you say is that America desperately needs a real non-piecemeal grand strategy for dealing with China. And you also assert that the strategy needs to be inclusive of a lot of different voices. Could you kind of tell us how you came to that conclusion and what does that mean?
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be with you, Alexiaa, and with Dan. And you're right. I mean, I did speak to some strategic juggernauts, and as I say in like page 2 of my book, the key insight of the book came from one-on-one lunch that I had with clearly the greatest living strategic thinker in the world, Henry Kissinger, in New York, and when I was in sabbatical in March 2018. And as actually, to be honest with you, I was a bit worried on that day. A snowstorm was threatening, and I was afraid, given his age, Henry Kissinger wouldn't turn up. But he turned up, and we sat in this private room in this club in New York, and we had a wonderful conversation. And after the conversation, I reflected very deeply, and I asked myself, what's the big message that Henry Kissinger was trying to convey to me? And I guess the big message he was trying to convey to me was that America had made a strategic mistake by launching a geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And of course, I had to get his permission to cite him in the book, and he gave me that permission. And so I basically, what my book does is build on that insight and tell Americans that it is in some ways inevitable, and this is what Graham Allison has documented, that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which is today China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, the world's #1 power always tries to push down the world #2 power. That's been happening a long time, so that's not surprising. Mm-hmm. But what's surprising is that when you compare what United States did with the Soviet Union, when United States, as you know, was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, the way it handled the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And one reason why it is brilliant is that a man called, another brilliant strategic thinker, whom I also actually met once before he passed away, George Kennan, gave some very valuable pieces of advice to America on how you manage a geopolitical contest. I'm just going to quickly mention 4 pieces of advice he gave. The first piece of advice he gave, he said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the geopolitical contest between the United States and Soviet Union is not going to depend on how many bullets or bombs we have. The military is a sideshow, especially there'll be no nuclear war. What he emphasized is that at the end of the day, the outcome will depend on the relative spiritual vitality of each society. And you remember Khrushchev very famously came to the US and banged his shoe and said, Soviet Union will overtake the United States. Of course, Soviet Union never did so. United States is a much stronger, much more powerful society and a happier society with the world's most affluent middle class. So United States is performing much better. But today, as I say in my book, by contrast, the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And as two Princeton University economists have documented, Case and Deaton, this has created a sea of despair among the white working classes. So if Kennan were alive today, he said, let's fix our home situation because that's the best way to defeat China. And then the second piece of advice he gave was cultivate friends and allies. And sadly, as you know, the Trump administration, whatever its strengths and weaknesses are, it has actually alienated some of its closest allies, including in Europe, and certainly demanding that Japan pay more, South Korea pay more, and so on and so forth. So again, doing the opposite of what Kennan advised. And the third thing that Kennan said was that even in this contest with the Soviet Union, we still have to deal with it. In this contest with China, you still have to deal with it. He says, so don't insult them. Don't insult your adversary. You still got to work with them. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of insults of China in the public space. And I'm not sure whether that's useful or worthwhile. Although I'm going to add a somewhat provocative note here, which is that some of it is due to the fact that there's what I call a yellow peril dimension in this US-China contest, which creates an emotional dimension, which I want to surface to talk about it so we can put it aside and not have it be a factor. And of course, the final piece of advice that Kennan gave was be humble, be modest. And that's the best way to win friends over. And again, I mean, I would say that that's what I remember. I worked very closely with the United States. Singapore and United States were on the same side in this contest against the Soviet Union. And when I was ambassador to the UN, as you mentioned, I worked very closely with the United States against the Soviet Union, against Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So I understood, I really had the pleasure of working with some of the best American diplomats in my life. And I think if America can bring back all the pieces of advice that Kennan gave, then America will be in a much stronger position in dealing with China.
I really could not possibly agree with you more. I'm very glad that you structured your answer the way that you did, primarily because for all of us that study foreign policy, international economics, there are no bigger names to cite than, George Kennan, right? There's no bigger names to cite. And when I can speak for myself, when I, traveled abroad, when I studied in different countries and I'm learning these things, we never talked about how these very important strategic thinkers not only helped us through the Cold War, but the advice that they gave and the timelessness of it, right? So when I am in discussion circles about China, it really ends up being kind of this fight that doesn't seem as historically thought out as I think I would enjoy for it to be. And I really hope people kind of really take the 4 points that you just mentioned alongside the point that Mr. Kissinger was trying to relate to you, because I think that they are extremely important. I know that I personally feel that to fix what is going on the outside, you need to clean your own house first. So I just love those points in your book. Those are actually some of my favorite points. So I'm glad that you started it with those. So Mr. Blumenthal, I actually have a very similar question for you. In your book, you highlight how China isn't a threat because they are this Goliath in comparison to the United States, but because as a major power, their weaknesses are so volatile that they put us all in danger. And since the US is also a global leader, if anything were to happen, we wouldn't have to just pick up our pieces, because as Mr. Mahbubani mentioned, we're so intertwined. We can't sit here and pick consistent fights and tease and be, very, rude to people that we do have to partner with, even though we do have some competitive elements with them. But, at the same time, we kind of got to prepare to protect ourselves just in case. And it's not even just ourselves that we would have to, protect in case something happened. It would also be, our allies. So, I'm kind of wondering, as a former DoD official, would you say America has a sufficient grand strategy approach in general, but, and also has our security apparatus thought about it from your perspective? Like, how would we support ourselves if, the nightmare did happen, something else happen past COVID, and how will we support, the rest of the globe?
Well, the short answer to your question is no, we don't have a sufficient grand strategy. But let me come back to that in a second. I mean, there's a lot of Cold War revisionism going on right now. Obviously, George Kennan was a great thinker who despaired of the way the Cold War was carried out and despaired of U.S. strategy in Vietnam. I think it would certainly be a surprise to him to hear that the U.S. was humble at a certain point, particularly during the Vietnam War. He despaired of over militarization in his view in Europe, and of course, us not going to war with the Soviets was a much closer call. I mean, there were so many chances that history is so complicated, and us avoiding war was sometimes just by chance. Obviously, during the Cold War, we had massive internal problems. I mean, we still had Jim Crow laws and terrible racial injustices. And 1968, the year Kissinger and Nixon was elected, we had a country falling apart. So we ought not be nostalgic too much about the Cold War or how much influence grand strategic thinkers like George Kennan actually had. Also, I think even in the 1990s, I think that was the time where our allies started accusing us of being the most arrogant, the French calling us a hyperpower that would just do whatever it wanted in the Balkans. And so again, we got to have some historical perspective on the complications of the messiness. There was a grand strategy that people agreed on, which was to contain Soviet expansionism, but there were probably 4 or 5 different Cold Wars during that period of time, and massive arguments about the proper way to conduct them. Let me come back to your question. So, during a certain period in the Cold War, the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a vicious debate in the U.S. system about whether the Soviets were overtaking America, or whether whether the Soviets were actually internally brittle and weak, and whether we could have a new strategy that pushed on those weaknesses. What my position on a grand strategy is that we should be very concerned with certain Chinese strengths and powers, certainly in the military and technology realm, in this very complicated realm that we're just sort of uncovering, which is this political influence and espionage and internal subversion of countries. The Australians are sort of the first to uncover just how far the Chinese Communist Party has gone to subvert their internal system, but we're doing so as well. That's not something, we haven't had a great power competition in a very long time, and that's not something that countries are used to anymore. How to protect your internal system from a rival who's trying to subvert it through engagement, economic engagement. So I would say that we don't have a sufficient grand strategy. We've started to just recently resist and push back on things that people have identified as problems for a very long time, whether it was the South China Sea, the Obama administration identified as a threat, but didn't respond adequately, or cyber theft, the hack of the of our main governmental system of personnel. We've been complaining about commercial issues, IP theft, and so on for a very long time. I think we're just in the early innings of trying to resist and push back, but I'd say, a sufficient grand strategy. The number one element I think that is missing, not just from U.S. government policy, but from analytical work outside, is what kind of actions actually most affect the Chinese in ways that we want. So what kind of actions actually would reverse certain policies that we don't like? What sort of actions would actually deter China from taking actions that we don't like? That's going to be a generational struggle to figure those things out. Finally, last point on your question itself. So I take the position that China poses a lot of different kinds of threats that we're waking up to, but we ought to also take them down a few pegs and say, look, their economy is in a lot of trouble. Talk about inequality. I mean, there's nothing like inequality in China. The people who have means are trying to leave China, as we see with students coming here, children of very wealthy and connected Chinese officials trying to come here and other places to study. Money is leaving China if it can. So again, so there are a lot of weaknesses. So we can, quote, win this competition without going to war. But yes, absolutely, we have to really identify those weak points and press on them to the point where we say to China, look, let's come to some sort of agreement that we don't keep this competition going forever.
Yeah, so thank you for your response. There's several things that I 110% agreed with. And, I just finished listening to a event that came out of the Pentagon about when we're trying to figure out what maneuvers or what things we actually need to do that will get China to not only be a partner, but also kind of hit them where we need to. That really does come into play when we think about how much we spend on our DoD budget and how much we spend on, the national security apparatus in that way. I really do appreciate how you, in your book, talk about making sure that we don't always make them seem as though they are 10 feet tall, and we don't always over romanticize our history as if we didn't incur, similar struggles in the past. So thank you so much for that answer. And, since you brought up economic and political, subversion in a way that we aren't used to, Mr. Mahbubani, you mentioned in your book how the US and our behavior with the US dollar has annoyed a ton of countries and a lot of allies included, because we've been seemingly reckless with exporting our domestic issues into the global financial system. US companies like Ripple have made it very clear that the race for new global payment systems, new global payments is on, right? And China is trying to create their own digital currency, and they've garnered support for the AIIB, and key allies created Instex so that they can transfer money without being bothered by the US, right? And, I just really feel like this is a piece of strategy that a lot of people don't talk about, because I think that we've kind of exposed the US dollar as a strategic Achilles heel. And you mentioned that in your book, and I just couldn't possibly agree more. And frankly, I could believe that to the average American, all this seems kind of like esoteric and like this has nothing to do with me-ish, but I don't think people really understand how damaging this type of subversion could be to our daily way of lives. And knowing how important that is, how would you advise our larger grand strategy around keeping the US dollar for the long term? I know this is not a short-term problem. This is definitely a very generations out problem, as Mr. Blumenthal said. But how would you advise keeping the US dollar internationally relevant in the long term and prepping America domestically for a case where maybe there are multiple forms of global currency, or where the US dollar isn't the preeminent global currency?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexiaa. You, by the way, you've asked a very difficult question.
Very difficult. I know. It is not fun. I was talking to you.
And I'll try to answer that as simply as possible. But before doing so, I want to say I completely agree with what Dan said when he said that in the Cold War, it's a mistake to see it in black and white terms. The story is much, much more complex. And I completely agree. I've just been reading a new book that John Mearsheimer, the political scientist, has come out with a book called American Diplomacy.
Yeah.
It's a series of essays by George Kennan. And this essays actually confirm what Dan just said, that George Kennan objected to be seen as just purely Mr. Containment. He had a much more sophisticated strategy than just being pure containment. And he was uncomfortable with many of the things that in the 1990s, for example, when the United States kept saying it's an exceptional nation, and Mearsheimer says he felt very uncomfortable with that. He said that's not what he should be doing. And as you all know, so he strongly opposed the war in Iraq and he thought that the war in Iraq was not necessary, would be a problem for United States, and he was unfortunately proven right in that dimension. And since you're talking of dollars, let me just mention one important figure that since 9/11, actually, you add up all the money that United States has spent on post 9/11 wars, it comes to $5 trillion. And if you spread the $5 trillion among the bottom 50% whose income has gone down, each citizen of the bottom 50% will get a check for $30,000. So this is why dollars are important. It's important to preserve dollars. But going back to the key issue you just raised about currency, and I as you know, one of the key points I make in the book is that most Americans, when you ask them what is the strongest weapon that the United States has, they would think, well, it's all our 6,000 nuclear weapons, or it could be our 13 aircraft carriers. Actually, the strongest weapon the United States has that can actually literally bring down countries is the US dollar and the control of the US dollar. And when the US dollar becomes the global reserve currency, as some French minister became President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing said, it gives America an exorbitant privilege. So let me just explain what that exorbitant privilege. Just imagine there are 10 families living in a village. Each of these 10 families, when they exchange goods with each other, one has got to maybe cultivate rice, one has got to make bread, one has got to keep goats, whatever it is. They do different activities, but if they don't work, they don't get an income and they cannot buy stuff, right? But just imagine there's one house in the village that it does work also, but if it needs money, all he has to do is got a special private printing machine. It prints the money, and somebody is working very hard producing rice. They just print the paper and give it to them and say, give me your rice, I give you a piece of paper. So the ability to print US dollars is the huge asset that the United States has. And in my book, I quote several economists who describe that because America has the global reserve currency, America is the only country that can live beyond its means. America is the only country that can have consistent fiscal deficits, that can consistently have foreign exchange deficits. You can't do that because you can print money. So it's a great privilege, but the privilege comes from the fact that countries are happy to use the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Now, the strategic mistake that the United States has made in the last 10 to 15 years is that it has weaponized the US dollar. So, for example, when France does trade with Iran, for example, if a French bank uses the US dollar, the French bank can pay a fine in a US court, and the highest fine that a French bank paid was $9 billion. Now that's billion dollars. So that, can you imagine how the French feel and how the others feel? And that's why, and I say one of the warning signals now is that three of America's closest allies, UK, France, and Germany, who are so upset about the US dollar being used as a weapon, are now creating an alternative payments mechanism to trade with Iran called INSTEX. Now, it's not succeeding. The US dollar is under no short-term threat at all. Let me emphasize that, because no currency comes close. And even though only 40% of trade may be financed by US dollars, over 90% of global foreign exchange transactions go with the US dollar. So the US dollar is truly almighty, very powerful. But you see, when you're almighty and very powerful, that's when you reach a moment of vulnerability. You don't realize that this is quite dangerous and that things can change overnight. Now, just to emphasize what the danger is, this is where the term Achilles heel comes from. When Argentina produces beef and sells to China, China has got to give US dollars to Argentina. And then when China produces textiles and sends to Argentina, Argentina's got to give US dollars to China because it's the most commonly used currency and everyone can see the value. But that's a job that can be done by something else. And now with the arrival of blockchain technology, and artificial intelligence and all that, you can actually create alternative units of value that can decide how many textiles you're going to exchange for how much beef. You don't need the US dollar anymore. So if that happens, if the US dollar loses its critical role in servicing international trade, it's not going to happen soon, let me emphasize that. But if it happens, as I say in my book, you know, sometimes if you see a house of cards, you just remove one card, the whole house comes down. So if you remove the role of the US dollar as a critical unit for facilitating international trade, when that disappears, then the whole house of cards may come down. If that happens, then America can no longer, and this, I'm not saying this, these are American economists are saying this, then America cannot live beyond its means. Therefore, so as a friend of America, I say it is in America's interest to preserve the role of the global reserve currency as long as possible. And the best way to preserve it is not to weaponize it and to have other countries welcome and embrace the US dollar. That's my sort of friendly advice to the United States.
Yeah, so, you know, I remember after reading that portion of your book, and then also I'm gonna go to Mr. Blumenthal for a similar question. It made extraordinary sense why I had to get my master's in international economics, because that is exactly what we were taught at Johns Hopkins. You know, amongst the other international affairs schools in DC, you know, mine is my favorite, we would have very similar conversations over beers. And it is a point that I think, you know, when people talk about the strategy between the US and China, it's about, you know, espionage and trade. And of course, those things are important. Of course, 110% those things are important. But we have to figure out the other things that actually make America strong. As Mr. Blumenthal mentioned earlier, what is it that we need to do? What are the things that we have to keep America, America? And what are the very nuanced things that we have to do to remain partners with China, but still also, you know, kind of poke them where they need to be poked? And I think that those are the types of nuances that between both of you, people need to talk about more. So Mr. Blumenthal, I felt that, you know, I think I mentioned this to you, this point was really important because you talk about the same thing. And from your perspective, China is catching up, you know, in high-tech warfare and reshaping global financial institutions to make them more compatible for themselves. And if other countries chose to follow that model, you know, and China, so if other countries chose to follow China's lead in trying to find another way to use currency as a means of global exchange, and then China weakens in the future because of, you know, some things that you point out, that would be really devastating for everyone. So I kind of wanted you to answer the same question from your perspective that you mentioned in your book.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so let me make just a few relatively quick points. The reason that China, and the interesting thing here, of course, is that China has provided low-cost financing to the U.S. deficits. But it's not because they're doing us any favors. It's because of massive distortions in their own financial system. So they want to subsidize producers over consumers. They don't want to open up their currency themselves. They don't want to open up their capital controls. So they are essentially reliant on surplus U.S. dollars. They talk a lot about internationalizing the RMB, but they take no steps inside China, which they view to be too risky to do anything to internationalize the RMB. In order to have a internationally traded currency, you need to have a free capital control system. So they, as much as they grumble, they want this current system, which is essentially, we in China are going to subsidize producers and exporters, and therefore continue to intervene in our own RMB and get a lot of surplus dollars and pummel them back into the U.S. bond market, or increasingly inside the U.S. And other countries' equity markets and so forth. So the dollar is not going away anytime soon. I would say we've been weaponizing it for a very long time, and thank God, because it's avoided a lot of wars. So the ability to put this kind of pressure on Iran and North Korea, for example, has proven to be a very innovative and sophisticated means of pressuring countries, isolating countries that most of our allies go along with, but without having to go to giving us a third choice between war and accommodation. Sure, people don't like it, but nobody is moving to do anything to provide an alternative to the U.S. dollar. That's not what I worry about the most. In terms of your question, the Chinese are certainly. So here's the complication. So China has a sophisticated grand strategy that they announced in 2017 in terms of their goals. It is to remake the world system in according to Chinese-led institutions, Chinese-led strategic partnerships to replace U.S. alliances, and so on. And as we saw recently, the Chinese have been working for many years to reshape international institutions, such as we saw with the World Health Organization, where they really lobbied to get their man in place from Ethiopia, a country that they had invested a lot of money in, and other developing countries throughout the world are continuing to do in international organizations. The U.S. and the West didn't pay enough attention. All of a sudden you have a situation where an international institution is essentially doing China's bidding rather than the world's bidding. So yeah, absolutely. I'm happy you picked up on that. That is a key part of Chinese grand strategy, which is to reshape institutions in order to protect essentially the Chinese system. And then finally, I'd say another part of the grand strategy is to push, as you said, what the Chinese call the socialist market economy within developing countries. So there's a lot of training they do for countries throughout the developing world, and they kind of propagate the idea that their system is more just, more equitable than the U.S. capitalism, which of course, if you measure up equity in China and the Gini coefficients and inequality, the U.S. does much better, even with all its problems, than China does. So, but they're absolutely moving forward on a plan to reshape the world order. That's why, my book is called The China Nightmare, and it starts off with grand ambitions, because the ambitions are very grand.
Understood. Yeah. So I think it's really, really interesting that you point out that perspective, because as we talk about how they are one way or the other trying to reshape global institutions or find a way to, act like they want to be in this global currency space, but aren't, actually taking the work to make that next step. A lot of people feel differently in other areas that they work in, right? So we all have heard the phrase securing a nation means securing our networks. Well, maybe you guys have. I have, primarily because this is like the thing that I like, right? And as we can see with the recent executive orders against WeChat and TikTok, everyone is struggling with this idea, on top of obviously all of the Huawei stuff and whatnot. Everyone is really struggling with this idea of how we should look at Chinese-led technologies entering the global market, and how that also shapes how they're trying to shape the institutions, to international institutions and other countries, to be a part of their tech. And so as we move forward with Chinese tech in our markets, how do you think we should improve the security of our networks or our cyber laws? And I kind of want you guys to take that question a little bit liberally, in the sense that you don't have to, specify specific legislation, but I want to think about this from a broader approach, especially from a national security perspective, because if the US chooses to ban these things, or the position that we choose to take internally, I feel like that's, fine. And, you can debate the merits of it, but it's not just about the US and blocking their space into our nation. If I have the statistic correct, more than 70% of the undersea internet lines are owned, by Chinese firms. So it's about how other nations also respond to their telecommunications infrastructure. So when I kind of want you guys to kind of take that question as you will. And I'd love to hear from Mr. Mahbubani first, and then we'll hit it back to you, Dan.
Thank you. I must say, Alexiaa, you specialize in asking very difficult questions. You're
I don't think they'd hire me if I did.
Very advanced. To get to your point about securing networks, because networks at the end of the day have to be shared and owned by the 193 countries in the world, And I'm very glad that Dan referred to the World Health Organization. And as someone who's been an ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I have some kind of feel about how international organizations work. And in my view, actually, of course, they can work very badly. Let me emphasize that. Okay? But they can also work very well. And, I wrote a book about global governance called The Great Convergence in 2013. And I begin the book actually by quoting another great American figure, President Bill Clinton, who in a speech in Yale in 2003 said something like, if America is going to be number one forever, then fine, America can keep on doing whatever it's doing. But somewhat unusually, he had a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world where America is no longer number one, then it's in America's long-term national interest to promote multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral institutions, multilateral processes, and so on and so forth. And so my book, Great Convergence, was built on that insight, how there's actually a long-term strategic convergence between the long-term interests of the United States to use multilateral institutions. And what President Bill Clinton was sort of saying implicitly was that, frankly, the best way, even if America becomes number two, when America becomes number two, the best way to constrain the number one is to strengthen multilateral rules that would constrain the number one. He didn't mention China, but he clearly had China in mind. And so I would say when it comes to dealing with China, the biggest mistake is actually to leave an organization and then leave it to China. Actually, it's in the interest of the United States to stay in that organization. And I want to emphasize that, in the past, let's say, for example, in the Ronald Reagan's time, when the United States left UNESCO, a few friends of the United States, including Singapore, left UNESCO as a sign of solidarity with the United States. But this time around, when the United States left World Health Organization, no one joined the United States. All the other countries stayed on. And in fact, I can also tell you, by the way, privately, that many of the African states were very, very upset that the United States left an organization that was being run by an African. It's not just the fact that he was Ethiopian, the fact he was African. And there's a great deal of African solidarity on these issues, which is one thing I learned as ambassador to the UN. So unfortunately, therefore, in some ways, the United States ended up looking back by leaving the World Health Organization at a time when every other country wanted the World Health Organization to be strengthened to deal with COVID-19. So I can tell you, it was a move where it was a classic case of shooting oneself in the foot when that happens. So coming to your question about telecommunications and how we manage that, the answer again is what Bill Clinton said: use multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral institutions, multilateral processes to guide these things. And as you know, we have something called the International Telecommunications Union. Now, the problem with multilateralism is that you don't always get 90%, 100% of what you want. You can never, nobody can, because if you want to work out a deal where 193 countries feel comfortable, you have to accept maybe 80 to 85% of what you want. But if that's enough for you, then you can go ahead. So for example, we have something called the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's not perfect, but it actually works very well most of the time. And most countries have exclusive economic zones, have rights of international passage. So all the rules of freedom of international navigation, freedom of international passage for the US Navy are all enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there are ways and means of solving these issues. Now, of course, there is, by the way, on a separate issue, there's going to be a big, what I call technology issue, which is a separate one of whose standards are going to be run the global show. So for example, when it comes to 5G, now I don't know enough about this area. I suspect, Alexiaa, you know more than I do. But if some countries adopt the Huawei 5G networks, and then other countries like United States does not do so, then you're going to have a bifurcated technology world. And so, for example, and for example, if the WhatsApp world is different from the WeChat world and they don't meet at all, what it means is that for the rest of the world who don't want to be forced to choose between WhatsApp and WeChat, now the rest of the world is going to walk around the world carrying two phones, one for their WhatsApp account, one for their WeChat account. So that's, you're going to have a two telephone world around the whole population. But we hope at some point in time, the countries outside anyway, of US and China, hope that there'll be some kind of minimal agreement reached between United States and China, where they agree on common standards, agree on safeguards, agree on ensuring that the technology is not used for spying and so on and so forth. Agree on all those things, and then hopefully you can then achieve something that one common technology base. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. And most countries in the world are trying to now prepare. You know, when you are a human being, if you are schizophrenic, it's a challenge. You're going to have to live with a schizophrenic technology world that is coming.
Yeah, no, I understand. Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I actually have like several more questions that I really want to ask, but these people are like lining up to ask us some questions. So I'm going to have to not be selfish. And after Dan finishes, I'm going to move on to audience Q&A, okay?
Yeah, just 3 quick points. One on this whole question of binding China through international organizations. That was the US grand strategy starting probably around 1992. It just didn't work. I mean, the Chinese do not follow. They signed on to the UN Law of the Sea and they don't follow it. The Philippines took them to court in the Hague Tribunal. The Chinese lost in an embarrassing way without the power backing of the United States back in 2015 and after. The Chinese simply ignored it. It has no teeth. The Chinese continue to militarize the South China Sea. Doesn't matter what the International Legal Tribunal said. China follows its national interests. The US follows its national interests. I'm loath to speak about the rest of the world and how they feel. I do have a sense. Number 2 is on the WHO. I think most countries feel that, again, loath to speak for them, that COVID-19 was made far worse by Chinese cover-ups and censorship, and we're kind of skirting over the main point here, which is China's a massive, colossal authoritarian country trying to control its own people and others. And now that they're doing that, the point of my book is that they're projecting those weaknesses and those maladies onto the rest of the world. Most countries felt like the WHO covered up because China told them to, and they are suffering greatly because of it. Now, what to do about those institutions? Just leaving them is not the answer either. But the idea, finally, we are at third point on technology is we are deeply in the 3GPP, which sets up wireless standards. We have found as we are in them that the Chinese have been doing what they do. They have been paying off countries and companies to vote with them, not on the best technology, but on a Chinese-based technology. And most countries are very resonating with the fact that if you have a Huawei-based standard, then you will have massive vulnerabilities in the protection of your own private consumer data. And that's resonating with publics, and that's why increasingly countries are saying, let's get this out of our system. We are working inside the International Telecommunications Union, but mostly to try to get China to back off its manipulations and get people to vote on the best international standards for 5G mobile technology.
Yeah, deeply agree with you. If we had more time, we could talk more about other countries and the choice versus the refusal versus, everything. I'm a nerd for this stuff, but I still have to really be respectful of y'all's time. I wish we could just kind of be on vacation and do this together, but I am going to move questions. And the first one that we have, I thought was pretty fair. They ask if each of you could make the US government do just one thing vis-a-vis the CCP, what would it be?
Vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, sir.
Dan, you want to go first?
Well, there are certain things that they are doing that are good. I mean, so let me tick a few of them off and then suggest others. They are rolling up networks of influence and espionage and economic and other malfeasance inside the United States through the Justice Department's China initiative. They are having more of a presence and military presence in the South China Sea. They are much more supportive of Taiwan, which is actually the model, I think, for the future of China. So they've done a pretty decent job in terms of their diplomacy on Huawei and 5G. But I think we have to be prepared to put more pressure on the CCP itself and on leaders inside the CCP to back off of like on Hong Kong, for example. It's been revealed in the New York Times and other places that that CCP princelings and other officials have massive real estate holdings in Hong Kong, and there's a lot more that can be done to pressure financially CCP high-level CCP members to change course and stop this sort of dragnet in Hong Kong, and that's just one example.
Yeah. Okay.
So my quick answer is that I would advocate that the CCP change its name from Chinese Communist Party to Chinese Civilization Party. Actually, I gave a lecture in Harvard University, the Harvard Kennedy School, on their annual lectures on the same subject. Because, there was a time when the main goal of the Chinese Communist Party was to promote communism. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party used to promote communism in Southeast Asia. But after Deng Xiaoping came to Southeast Asia, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, told Mr. Deng Xiaoping, if you're going to promote communism, then you cannot be our friends. You've got to stop promoting communism. And he did it. He stopped supporting the communist parties in Southeast Asia. The primary goal of the CCP now is not to promote communism globally, but to revive the Chinese civilization and make it once again one of the most successful civilizations in the world. And the most important statistic to know about what the CCP has done is that if you look at Chinese civilization and its 4,000 years of history, and if you try to pick the best 40 years that in 4,000 years that the Chinese people have had, the Chinese people have experienced far greater improvement in their standard of living, in eradication of poverty, in improving life expectancy, in having access to healthcare, in having access to education, all the basic life needs. They have seen a greater improvement in the past 40 years than they have in the past 4,000 years. So if there's any party that has done the best to revive Chinese civilization, it is the CCP. So it should change its name to Chinese Civilization Party.
I am very confident most people were not expecting that answer, but that is an outstanding stat to point out. There's another question. It's asking to both of you all, but if one of you all don't want to answer that, it's perfectly okay. And they ask, do you have any thoughts about the potential of digital currency specifically to disrupt the current role of the US dollar in the world economic system? What might the US do to head such concerns off at the pass in cooperation with US tech firms? So this is a little bit like the question I asked, but they're asking, how can the US grand strategy do that with tech? Silicon Valley, Austin, New York.
Well, I mean, let me give a quick answer. I think Dan is probably a better expert than I am, but my sense is yes, there can be a digital currency, but I would add the but it's very difficult. And most countries in the world like to have some control of their currency because it's one of the chief instruments for managing their economy, right? That's why. But so if a digital currency comes along that is independent and doesn't depend on national control, then it becomes a threat to economic management. And that's why it's noticed that there was a tremendous amount of global resistance when Facebook proposed a currency. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the European countries were among those which were most uncomfortable about the idea of a Facebook currency. So yes, it can be done, but there'll be a lot of political resistance. But I suspect Dan knows more than I do on the subject.
I don't. I mean, science education. The only thing I know is about currencies is what I mentioned before. The U.S. has a free floating currency, free capital market, and an enormous amount of wealth and assets that backs its currency. So until some country has those ingredients, I don't see much of a threat, real systemic threat to the U.S. Currency dominance.
Okay, understood. So I have, oh man. Oh gosh, we just got another good question in. But I really want to ask this one. We only have a couple minutes. Okay, let me hurry up. Are there a handful of concrete markers to measure that you think we should have to show that the U.S. has created a fully competent strategy to cause or to cause the CCP to collapse or Taiwan-style democracy to peacefully take over? I think the question is trying to ask, we've done all this talk about grand strategy. This is important and this isn't la la la. What are the markers that we need to see that the public can say, okay, now I feel confident? Because as you mentioned earlier, Dan, everyone could disagree. That's fine, but we knew the goal was containment for the Cold War. I think maybe this person is trying to ask a similar question for our grand strategy with the CCP.
Well, a great question. It's extremely complicated. There are obviously some elements of containing the military expansionism. There's some elements of continuing the enmeshment with China because it does constrain them. It doesn't change them, but it constrains them. But there is this question, I think, that the questioner is getting at, which is the promotion of freedom in China, particularly since there's so many in China fighting for just basic justice and freedom and the ability to practice their religions, whether they're Uyghur Muslims or whether they're Christians or Buddhists, and the repression is harsh. The freedom to assemble, the freedom to speak, the freedom even on WeChat now, it's censored, in terms of speaking about COVID. And the U.S. has to figure out what role it wants to play in terms of promoting more freedoms, because again, so many Chinese want those freedoms, and they go to Taiwan when they were allowed to, and envy. I think it would be a mistake for the Chinese Communist Party to call it the civilizational party, because then all of a sudden they would be speaking for all Chinese people everywhere. And the Taiwanese have their own interpretation of Chinese civilization in democratic forms, for example. So, and then your question as to markers, I think that I think certain markers, from a sort of extremely concrete perspective, a China that which has left a path of reform and opening many years ago, it's closing up and dominated by state-owned enterprises. It's on a path of mass repression. I think one marker would be China turning back to the Deng Xiaoping years and looking more internally on how to reform and open up its economy and to some extent its political system.
My answer would be that I think it was one of your great founding fathers, I forget which one, said America must show a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. And I would say, if you're going back to George Kennan emphasized, and this is one of his key phrases, it is important to create an impression among the peoples of the world. Very critical phrase, peoples of the world, that America is a society which is far more vital and more vibrant than any other society. So, and so at the end of the day, I would say it's the question of what the eyes of there are 7.8 billion people in the world, 330 million in the US, 1.4 billion in China. that still leaves 6 billion people outside. So the question is, what do the 6 billion people think about what the United States is doing, what China is doing? How do they evaluate both? Who do they see to be more friendly to them? Who do they think is helping them more? And which countries, for example, do they trade with more? Which countries do they have more engaged with more? So there are objective, empirical ways of measuring which country is succeeding more in terms of winning the hearts and minds of the 6 billion outside. So the answer to the question about is a new grand, what would be the new grand strategy? The simple answer is a new grand strategy must be one that can win over the hearts and minds of 6 billion people. It's as simple as that.
I think you all's answer is the best way to possibly have ended this. I know we have some early risers out there that have chosen to join us, and I am so grateful for you all for coming and speaking to us with such disparate time zones. Thank you so much, Mr. Mahbubani. Thank you so much, Mr. Blumenthal. I loved every second of this. My little nerd gut and heart is just blossoming and blooming. We are going to put this is going to be on Facebook Live. This is obviously going to be on YouTube. So I'm sure you all's words are going to reach. Again, everyone, please support their books. They are magnificent. That is the reason we were able to have such a rich discussion today. Otherwise, to those we didn't get to answer your questions, I'm sorry, but just come to the next event. We're going to have more of these and it's going to be okay. Thank you all. And I hope everyone has a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See ya.
Take care.